A letter shouldn't have survived that explosion, but it did. Carried for 7 years in Caleb Mercer's jacket pocket like a stone against his ribs, growing heavier with each passing season until the weight became unbearable. Now he stands at Mara Ellington's door in Asheville, the envelope trembling in his calloused hands, knowing that what he delivers tonight will either heal or destroy them both. Some promises to the fallen demand more than silence. They demand a reckoning neither survivor is ready to face. Subscribe to witness what truth does to those brave enough to hold it. The October evening had settled over Asheville, with that particular quality of mountain twilight that makes everything seem both closer and impossibly distant. The sky bleeding purple and amber through the dense canopy of oaks that lined Hawthorne Ridge, and Mara Ellington stood at her kitchen window, watching the light fade, as she had done countless times in the 7 years since Daniel died. Her hands submerged in dishwater that had gone cold without her noticing, her mind drifting between the present moment and the ghost-populated past that never quite released its grip on her consciousness. The house around her had become both sanctuary and prison. Each room, a careful construction of normalcy she'd built brick by brick after the military. Chaplin appeared at this same door with folded flag and practiced condolences, and she'd learned to navigate the space without breaking down at the sight of his reading chair or the coffee mug she couldn't bring herself to donate or discard. Outside, the first leaves of autumn scraped across the porch in a rhythm that sounded almost like footsteps, and she'd trained herself not to turn toward every sound that suggested arrival, not to hope for resurrections that would never come, though some primitive part of her brain still sparked with impossible anticipation whenever she heard movement beyond these walls. The knock, when it finally came, carried a weight that distinguished it from the casual tap of neighbors or delivery drivers, a deliberate quality that suggested the person on the other side had stood there gathering courage for longer than a simple errand would require, and Mara's hands stilled in the cooling water as her pulse quickened with an anxiety she couldn't immediately name. She dried her hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle, wiping each finger with more care than necessary, postponing the moment when she would have to answer that insistent sound and invite whatever disruption waited on the other side of her carefully maintained equilibrium. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, she could make out a masculine silhouette, tall and broad-shouldered, standing with a stillness that military training stamps into a body and never quite releases, and something in her chest tightened with recognition, even though she couldn't see his face clearly through the distorted glass. The knock came again, softer this time, almost apologetic, and she found herself moving toward the door with a sense of inevitability, as though this moment had been approaching for years and had finally arrived to collect what it was owed. When Mara opened the door, the man standing on her porch looked simultaneously young and ancient, his face carrying the particular weathering that comes not from years, but from experiences that age a person from the inside out. And his eyes held a haunted quality she recognized immediately because she saw it in her own mirror every morning when she couldn't avoid her reflection. He wore civilian clothes that hung slightly wrong on his frame, as though his body still expected the structure of a uniform, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a worn jacket that had seen better decades. His shoulders hunched slightly forward in a posture of perpetual bracing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, Mara felt the years collapse between them, sensed that whatever had brought this stranger to her threshold was connected to the worst day of her life, to Daniel and dust and the desert that had swallowed her husband whole and returned only fragments. The man's throat worked as though words were stones he had to swallow before he could speak, and when his voice finally emerged, it carried the rough texture of disuse, of someone who had spent too long in his own company without the softening influence of regular conversation. "Mrs. Ellington," he said, and the formal address sounded strange in the informal dusk. weighted with significance she couldn't yet decode. "My name is Caleb Mercer. I served with your husband in Afghanistan. I'm sorry to show up unannounced like this, but there's something I need to give you. Something I should have brought years ago but couldn't." His hand emerged from his pocket, holding an envelope that looked as though it had been handled obsessively, the edges softened with constant touch, the paper bearing stains that might have been sweat or sand or tears. And Mara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized Daniel's handwriting on the front. That familiar scrawl she'd memorized from love notes and grocery lists, and the few letters he'd managed to send during deployment. The sight of it punched through her carefully constructed composure like a fist through paper, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep her knees from buckling because the dead weren't supposed to send mail, weren't supposed to reach across the years with messages that could upend everything she'd built in their absence. Caleb's eyes tracked her reaction with an intensity that suggested he'd anticipated this moment countless times, rehearsed it in his mind until every possible response was catalogued and prepared for. Yet the reality of her pain still seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and his free hand came up as though to steady her before falling back to his side, uncertain of the boundaries between them or the rules governing this impossible interaction. "He wrote it the night before the ambush," Caleb continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment holding them both in place. "He asked me to make sure you got it if anything happened to him, and I carried it out of that valley. Carried it through 2 more deployments and 6 different cities, and 7 years of trying to figure out how to face you with what I know." The confession spilled out of him with the urgency of something too long contained, and Mara could see the cost of that containment written in every line of his face, in the dark circles under his eyes, and the tremor in his hands that suggested sleep came rarely and lightly, and never without nightmares chasing him into whatever brief rest he managed to find. The evening had deepened while they stood there, the last light draining from the sky and leaving them in that transitional darkness before streetlights flickered on. And Mara realized they were still standing in the doorway, her blocking his entry, him making no move to press forward, both of them frozen in this liminal space where past and present collided with explosive force. She stepped back wordlessly, a gesture that might have been invitation or surrender, and Caleb followed her into the house with the careful steps of someone entering sacred ground, his eyes taking in the photographs on the walls and the arrangements of memory that transformed living space into memorial. And she saw him recognize aspects of Daniel in the artifacts she'd preserved, the framed deployment photo, the shadow box with medals and ribbons, the bookshelf still holding volumes Daniel had intended to read but never got the chance to finish. The letter in Caleb's hand seemed to pulse with presence, demanding acknowledgement, demanding the courage to accept what it represented. And Mara couldn't take her eyes off it, couldn't reconcile the familiar handwriting with the impossible fact of its existence, couldn't begin to imagine what words Daniel had chosen for what he must have known might be his final message to the woman he'd promised to grow old beside, but instead left to grow old alone. The living room felt too small for the weight of what needed to be said, the carefully arranged furniture and neutral walls suddenly oppressive in their normalcy, and Mara found herself gesturing toward the couch while she took the chair opposite, needing distance even as some part of her wanted to snatch the letter from Caleb's hands and tear it open immediately. Consequences be damned. Caleb sat with the rigid posture of someone whose body never fully relaxed, perched on the edge of the cushion as though ready to bolt at any moment, and the envelope rested on his knees, like evidence in a trial where both of them were simultaneously accused and accuser, victim and judge. The silence between them stretched and compressed, filled with 7 years of absence, and the presence of a man who existed now only in memory and fading photographs, And Mara realized that whatever Caleb was about to tell her would fundamentally alter the shape of her grief, would force her to rebuild her understanding of Daniel's final days from whatever materials this stranger provided. "Tell me about that day," Mara heard herself say, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know. Wasn't sure her carefully reconstructed stability could withstand the details she'd spent years avoiding, the specifics that nightmares suggested but waking consciousness mercifully obscured. Caleb's jaw tightened, muscles jumping under skin that had seen too much sun and carried too many scars, and his eyes fixed on some middle distance that existed neither in her living room nor in present time, but in that desert valley where men died, and survivors were forged into something harder and more haunted. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat affect of someone recounting trauma while trying to maintain emotional distance. A defensive monotone that couldn't quite mask the raw grief still churning beneath the surface. "We were supposed to be on a routine supply run," he began, the words emerging with the practiced quality of a story told many times to therapists and fellow veterans and the empty walls of too many temporary apartments. 6 vehicles, 12 men, a route we'd traveled dozens of times before without incident. But someone talked, or someone got sloppy with operational security, or maybe we just ran out of luck that morning. In war, the why doesn't matter much when the bullets start flying. The ambush had come at dawn, Caleb explained, his hands unconsciously miming the shapes of weapons and positions as he reconstructed the scene. When the convoy entered a narrow pass between 2 ridges and the world exploded into sound and fury and the particular chaos that combat introduces into human experience. The lead vehicle took an improvised explosive device that lifted it 3 feet off the ground before slamming it back down in a twisted wreck of metal and screaming. And before the echo of that first blast faded, they were taking fire from elevated positions on both sides. A coordinated attack that suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of their route and timing. Mara felt her stomach clench as Caleb described the confusion of those first moments, the way training took over when conscious thought became impossible, the automatic responses that separated survivors from casualties in the terrible mathematics of combat. Daniel had been in the 3rd vehicle, Caleb in the 4th, and when the shooting started, each man's world contracted to the immediate imperatives of survival: find cover, return fire, account for your squad members, adapt to circumstances that shifted moment by moment in ways no amount of training could fully prepare you for. "Daniel was a good soldier," Caleb said, and there was something in the way he emphasized the word "was" that suggested the sentence contained more than simple eulogy, that the past tense carried complications Mara couldn't yet perceive. He kept his head when men twice his age were losing theirs, directed fire, coordinated with the other vehicles, did everything by the book while the world turned into hell around us. But there was a hesitation in Caleb's voice, a catching on words that hinted at unspoken qualifications, and Mara leaned forward in her chair, sensing that the story was approaching some crucial turning point where the official narrative she'd received and the truth Caleb carried diverged in significant ways. The air between them seemed to thicken with anticipation, charged with the approaching revelation, and Mara realized she was holding her breath, her fingernails digging into the arms of her chair, hard enough to leave marks in the upholstery. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames and carrying the smell of approaching rain, and the atmospheric pressure seemed to mirror the emotional pressure building in the small living room. The firefight had lasted 47 minutes, Caleb continued, though time became elastic in combat, stretching and compressing in ways that made duration meaningless, every second containing eternities of fear and adrenaline and the hyperclarity that comes when death stands close enough to touch. They'd managed to establish a defensive perimeter, call for air support, hold their position against an enemy that outnumbered them but lacked their training and equipment. And gradually the tide turned, as it usually did when American firepower came to bear on a tactical situation. But in the chaos of combat, in the confusion of smoke and noise, and the tunnel vision that survival instinct produces, choices get made that look different in the clear light of aftermath. And Daniel had made a choice that saved lives but cost him something essential, something that apparently haunted him enough to write a letter confessing what he'd done. Caleb's hands trembled as he spoke about the final moments of the engagement, about the wounded they'd collected and the dead they'd mourned, and the heavy silence that settled over the survivors when the shooting finally stopped and they could count the cost of their survival. Daniel had taken a round through the upper chest during the last minutes of the fight, a wound that would have been survivable if the evacuation helicopter had arrived 20 minutes earlier. But in war, timing is everything, and mercy rarely arrives when most needed. Caleb had held Daniel while they waited for medical evacuation, had applied pressure to the wound, and spoken the lies that dying men need to hear. That help was coming, that he'd be fine, that this was just a temporary setback before returning home to the life waiting for him. But Daniel had known, as dying men often do, that his time was measured in minutes rather than hours, and he'd used those precious final moments to extract a promise from Caleb, to make him swear he'd deliver the letter and tell Mara the truth about what happened in that valley, about the choice Daniel made and the guilt that came with survival purchased at a particular price. "He made me promise," Caleb said, his voice breaking for the first time, the careful control finally fracturing under the weight of 7 years of carrying this burden. "Made me swear I'd find you and give you the letter and tell you everything. Not the sanitized version the army would send, but the real story, the complicated truth that doesn't fit on a casualty notification form or sound good at memorial services." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized the letter in Caleb's hands contained more than final endearments, that Daniel's last message carried confessions she wasn't certain she wanted to receive. The envelope seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as it sat between them, and Mara couldn't bring herself to reach for it, couldn't cross that final distance between ignorance and knowledge, between the Daniel she'd constructed in memory and the man who had written these words while contemplating his own mortality. Caleb watched her internal struggle with the patience of someone who had spent years approaching this moment, who understood that courage arrives in its own time and cannot be rushed, and the compassion in his eyes suggested he would wait however long it took for her to be ready. But there was also urgency there, a need to finally complete the task he'd carried for so long, to discharge the obligation that had prevented him from fully returning to civilian life or finding peace in the aftermath of war. The rain that had been threatening finally arrived, tapping against the windows with increasing insistence, and the sound provided a kind of auditory privacy, a white noise that made the small living room feel even more isolated from the outside world and whatever normal concerns occupied people who weren't confronting ghosts from battlefields half a world away. "What did he do?" Mara asked, the question emerging in a whisper that barely disturbed the air between them, and she saw Caleb flinch, as though she'd struck him, saw the way he seemed to physically brace himself for the telling. He looked down at the letter, then back up at her face, and she watched him make some internal calculation about how much detail she needed, how graphic he should be in reconstructing those final, terrible minutes when her husband became a casualty statistic and left her to navigate decades of life alone. "There was a moment," Caleb began slowly, choosing each word with visible care, "when everything hung in the balance. We had wounded who needed evacuation immediately, but the landing zone wasn't secure yet. And bringing in the helicopter while we were still taking fire would have been suicide for the flight crew. The tactical situation Caleb described sounded impossible. One of those scenarios where every option carried unacceptable costs, and the least terrible choice still meant someone would die. And Mara felt her chest tighten as she understood they were approaching the heart of Daniel's confession, the action that had prompted him to write a letter of apology and explanation to the wife he loved. In that crucible moment, with wounded men bleeding out and an enemy that refused to disengage and air support still minutes away, Daniel had made the call that officers are trained to make but never fully prepared for. He'd ordered a risky maneuver that would either save his squad or get more of them killed in the attempt. Caleb's voice grew quieter as he described Daniel's decision to take 3 men, Caleb among them, and flank the enemy position that had them pinned down, to move through terrain that offered minimal cover in order to suppress the fighters enough that medical evacuation could proceed. It was tactically sound, but personally terrifying, the kind of order that asks men to risk certain death for probable success. And Caleb could see in retrospect how much that decision cost Daniel, how the weight of potentially sending men to their deaths wore on him even as he prepared to lead the assault himself rather than sending others where he wouldn't go. They'd moved through that gauntlet of fire with speed, born of desperation and training, had taken the position and silenced the weapons that had been keeping the helicopter away, and in doing so had saved 5 men who would have died without immediate medical attention. But in war, victory and tragedy often arrive hand in hand, and Daniel's heroic maneuver had succeeded at a cost he apparently couldn't reconcile with his conscience or his sense of what kind of man he wanted to be. During the assault, in the confusion of close combat and split-second decisions, Daniel had taken a shot that killed an enemy fighter who might, and this was the terrible uncertainty that had haunted him, have been surrendering, might have been trying to drop his weapon and raise his hands in submission when Daniel's training and adrenaline and fear converged into a trigger pull that ended a life. Caleb's description of that moment contained none of the moral certainty that usually attends combat narratives, none of the clean distinctions between hero and enemy that make war bearable in its retelling, and Mara felt the complexity of it wash over her like cold water, shocking and clarifying. Daniel had believed in the moment that he was taking a hostile fighter who posed a threat, but in the seconds after, when the body fell and the weapon clattered away and he saw the man's face, he'd been seized by doubt, by the terrible possibility that he'd killed someone who was trying to quit fighting. He couldn't know for certain, Caleb said, his own voice thick with the weight of witnessing Daniel's anguish in those final minutes as he lay dying. None of us could. In combat, you have a fraction of a second to make decisions that philosophers debate for centuries, and you live with the consequences whether they were right or wrong. But Daniel had been unable to grant himself that grace, had carried the uncertainty as an accusation against his own character, and apparently believed that if he died without confessing this ambiguity, without acknowledging his doubt and the possibility of his error, he would be perpetrating a fraud on the woman who loved him and believed him incapable of crossing certain moral lines. The letter, Caleb explained, contained Daniel's attempt to explain what had happened, to confess his uncertainty and his guilt, to ask Mara's forgiveness for being perhaps less than the hero she might have imagined him to be. It was an act of honesty that came at tremendous cost, forcing Mara to confront the reality that the man she loved was human and flawed and capable of mistakes that haunted him even unto death. Mara sat in stunned silence, processing this information that reconfigured everything she thought she knew about Daniel's final day, and she felt the foundations of her grief shift beneath her, like tectonic plates finding new alignment. Part of her wanted to rage at this revelation, to reject the complication it introduced into her carefully preserved memory of a husband who died a hero and left her with a legacy of pride, if not presence. But another part of her, the part that had actually known Daniel as a living, breathing, complicated man rather than a memorial, recognized the truth in what Caleb described. Daniel had always been plagued by his conscience, had been the kind of person who agonized over right and wrong, even when others would have dismissed such concerns as impractical or naive. This confession wasn't an indictment of his character, but evidence of it, proof that even in extremity he'd refused to allow convenience or self-preservation to override his commitment to honesty and moral accountability. She looked at Caleb, really looked at him for the first time, and saw the toll that carrying this burden had taken, the way serving as messenger and witness and keeper of difficult truths had worn him down to something fragile and essential. Mara finally reached for the envelope, her hands surprisingly steady despite the trembling she felt in her core, and the paper felt both impossibly heavy and weightless against her fingers as she held Daniel's final words. Caleb sat back slightly, giving her space for this private moment, though his eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that suggested he needed to witness her reaction, needed confirmation that delivering this burden hadn't been a mistake or an act of cruelty disguised as honoring a promise. The envelope was sealed with tape that had yellowed over the years, and Mara could see where moisture or sweat had warped the paper, could trace with her fingertip the stains that suggested this letter had been carried close to Caleb's body through conditions that should have destroyed something so fragile. She turned it over in her hands, postponing the moment of opening, and noticed how her name was written in Daniel's familiar scrawl, but with a shakiness that suggested he'd written it under stress or in difficult conditions. The letters slightly irregular in a way that made her heart ache with recognition of the circumstances under which these words were composed. When she finally tore open the envelope, the sound seemed too loud in the quiet living room, a small violence that released the contents and all the implications they carried, and she unfolded the pages, 3 sheets covered front and back with Daniel's handwriting, more words than she'd expected. More detail than she'd imagined he'd have time to write during what must have been a brief respite from danger. The date at the top confirmed what Caleb had told her. The letter was written the night before the ambush, composed in whatever quiet moments soldiers steal between missions when the possibility of death transitions from abstract knowledge to immediate probability. Mara's eyes skimmed the opening lines, which contained the expected endearments and assurances of love, the conventional language that soldiers use when facing mortality and wanting to leave their loved ones with final proof of devotion. But as she read deeper, the tone shifted, became more urgent and confessional, and she realized Daniel was preparing her for the possibility that if she received this letter, it meant he hadn't survived, and she would need to hear certain truths he'd been carrying. Daniel wrote about the weight of command, about how leading men in combat required making calculations with human lives that seemed impossible until circumstances forced choice. And Mara could feel his struggle with the moral complexity of his position, even through the static distance of written words. He described the particular fear that came not from personal danger, but from the responsibility of making decisions that would determine whether the men under his leadership returned home or filled body bags. And she recognized in his description the kind of pressure that would have ground against his fundamentally decent nature like stone on stone. The letter contained details about daily life in the deployment that he'd never shared during their brief satellite phone conversations or in his earlier letters. The boredom punctuated by terror, the way humor became dark and necessary as a release valve for unbearable tension. The strange intimacy that developed between men who lived in constant proximity to death and learned to find meaning in small rituals and shared hardship. Reading these paragraphs, Mara felt she was meeting a version of her husband she'd never fully known. The soldier Daniel, who existed in a context so foreign to her civilian experience that translation between their worlds had been incomplete at best. But then, the letter turned to the confession Caleb had warned her about, and Mara felt her breath catch as Daniel described in his own words the incident that had apparently shattered his moral certainty and left him carrying guilt he couldn't resolve. His account aligned with what Caleb had told her, but contained the internal dimension, the subjective experience of making a split-second choice and then living with the uncertainty of whether that choice crossed a line he'd promised himself never to cross. Daniel wrote about seeing the fighter's face in the moment after, about the expression frozen there that might have been aggression or might have been surrender, about how, in the microseconds when human life ended, he'd been unable to determine with confidence whether he'd acted in legitimate defense or committed something closer to execution. The anguish in his words was palpable, bleeding through the page in the form of crossed-out phrases and ink blots where the pen had lingered while he searched for language adequate to his moral distress. And Mara felt tears streaming down her face as she confronted the depth of her husband's suffering in those final days of his life. What struck her most forcefully, however, was what the letter didn't say, the absences that spoke as loudly as the present words, and she found herself reading between the lines for the full story that Daniel either couldn't articulate or chose not to burden her with. He didn't mention, for instance, the physical pain of his wounds or the fear of dying far from home and the life he'd built with her, didn't dwell on the sensory horror of combat or the specific ways bodies break under the machinery of modern warfare. Instead, he focused obsessively on the moral question, on his uncertainty about whether he'd maintained his integrity under the worst pressure imaginable. And Mara realized this selectivity revealed something essential about who Daniel had been and what he'd valued above even his own survival. The letter asked for her forgiveness, but she understood now that what Daniel really needed was her witness, her acknowledgement that he'd faced an impossible situation and struggled to maintain his humanity despite circumstances designed to strip it away. He needed her to know that if he died, believing he'd committed an injustice, that belief mattered to him more than any posthumous honor or memorial that whitewashed the complex reality of his final days. Mara looked up from the letter to find Caleb watching her with eyes that held both hope and dread, waiting to learn how she would receive this complicated gift of truth. And she saw in his expression the same moral seriousness that had characterized Daniel's letter, the same refusal to accept easy answers or comfortable lies when hard questions demanded engagement. "He asked you to tell me everything," Mara said, her voice rough from crying but stronger than she'd expected, and Caleb nodded slowly, visibly bracing himself for whatever additional burden she was about to place on him. The rain continued its percussion against the windows, and the evening had deepened into full night without either of them noticing. The world beyond this small room fading into irrelevance while they navigated the dangerous territory of truth and memory and the responsibility they owed to the dead. Mara folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope, and she felt something shift in her chest. Some tight knot of idealized grief beginning to loosen as she made space for a more complicated understanding of the man she'd loved and lost. The storm that had been building all evening finally broke with full force, wind driving rain against the house in waves that rattled the structure and made the lights flicker uncertainly, and the violence of the weather seemed to externalize the emotional turbulence churning through both occupants of the small living room. Caleb had been preparing to leave, to complete his mission of delivery and retreat back into whatever isolated existence he'd constructed for himself. But Mara found herself asking him to stay, unable to let him disappear now that he'd opened this door to Daniel's interior life and the final days she'd been excluded from. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy prolonged contact implied, but something in her voice, or the wildness of the storm, convinced him, and he settled back onto the couch with visible reluctance. A man who had learned not to trust comfort or connection, but couldn't refuse this direct request. The power fluctuated again, dimming and surging, casting strange shadows that transformed familiar spaces into something alien and uncertain. And Mara thought how appropriate it was that this confrontation with the past should occur during such atmospheric violence, as though the universe itself demanded drama commensurate with the emotional stakes involved. She made coffee because domesticity provided structure when conversation threatened to become overwhelming, and the familiar ritual of grinding beans and measuring water gave her hands something to do, while her mind tried to process everything the evening had delivered. Caleb accepted the mug she offered with visible gratitude, wrapping both hands around it as though drawing comfort from its warmth. And she noticed how his fingers were scarred in ways that suggested manual labor or repeated injury, the hands of someone who had worked hard to survive rather than thrive in whatever life he'd constructed after leaving the military. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the storm and sipping coffee that was stronger than necessary. And Mara felt the weight of unasked questions pressing against her throat, demanding voice, but not yet finding the courage to emerge. Caleb looked different now than when he'd arrived, some of the rigidity gone from his posture, as though delivering the letter had released him from a portion of the burden he'd been carrying, though his eyes still held that haunted quality that suggested sleep would not come easily, even after this mission was complete. "Tell me about the promise," Mara finally said, setting her mug down with more force than intended and watching the coffee slosh dangerously close to the rim. "Not just what Daniel asked you to do, but what it's cost you to carry this for 7 years. The question seemed to catch Caleb off guard, and she watched him struggle with whether to deflect or engage with the personal territory she'd just opened, saw the conflict between trained reticence and desperate need to be understood warring across his face. Outside, a branch broke somewhere in the darkness, the crack loud enough to penetrate the house's walls, and both of them startled at the sound. Combat reflexes that never quite faded, even in civilian contexts, where threats were statistical rather than immediate. Caleb's hand had moved toward his hip in an automatic gesture before he caught himself and forced his body to relax. And Mara recognized in that aborted movement the persistent hypervigilance that so many veterans carried as unwanted souvenirs from war zones where inattention could be fatal. Caleb spoke haltingly at first, but gradually the words began to flow with the desperate momentum of confession too long deferred, and he told her about the years since leaving Afghanistan, about the succession of jobs he'd lost because anger or flashbacks made him unreliable, about the relationships that failed because he couldn't explain why he woke screaming or why crowded places sent him into panic spirals. He'd carried Daniel's letter through all of it, through episodes of homelessness and the grinding poverty that attends veterans whose injuries aren't visible enough to qualify for adequate benefits, through the bureaucratic nightmare of trying to access mental health care in a system overwhelmed and underfunded. The letter had become both talisman and curse, a reminder of the one thing he still needed to accomplish, even as it represented a connection to the war he was desperately trying to leave behind. And he'd found himself unable to complete the simple task of delivering it, because doing so meant confronting the full reality of what they'd survived and what it had cost. Mara listened with growing horror and compassion, realizing that Caleb's suffering was in some ways more prolonged than Daniel's quick death, That survival carried its own terrible price that society preferred not to acknowledge or address. He told her about the nightmares that played Daniel's death on repeat, about how he'd held her husband while blood soaked through bandages that couldn't staunch wounds too severe for field medicine, about the specific quality of Daniel's breathing as it became labored and then stopped altogether. These details should have been unbearable to hear, but Mara found herself grateful for them, grateful that someone who loved Daniel had been with him in those final moments, that he hadn't died alone in some impersonal medical evacuation or anonymous hospital, far from anyone who knew his name or cared about his particular existence. Caleb described how Daniel had used his last coherent moments not to speak about his own fear or pain, but to extract a promise that Caleb would find Mara and deliver the letter and tell her the full truth about what had happened, making Caleb swear on their friendship and shared experience that he wouldn't let her live, with a sanitized version of events that erased Daniel's complexity and moral struggle. That promise had become the organizing principle of Caleb's post-war existence, the one obligation he couldn't discharge and couldn't forget. And it had prevented him from moving forward or finding peace because some part of him believed he didn't deserve rest until he'd fulfilled this final duty. The storm reached its peak intensity as Caleb finished speaking, rain hammering the roof with such force that conversation became difficult, and lightning transformed the room into a series of stark tableaux, frozen in silver light before plunging back into shadow. Mara felt something break open inside her chest, some carefully maintained dam that had held back not just grief for Daniel, but fury at the systems that sent young men to war and then abandoned them to navigate the aftermath alone. And she found herself weeping, not just for her dead husband, but for this living man who had sacrificed so much to honor a promise that no one should have to keep. She crossed the space between them without conscious decision, moving to sit beside Caleb on the couch, and when she took his hand in hers, she felt him stiffen before slowly relaxing, allowing the contact he'd probably denied himself for years out of some misplaced sense that he didn't deserve comfort or human connection. They sat like that while the storm raged outside, two people united by their connection to a dead man and by the particular species of grief that comes from understanding that good people die while asking forgiveness for being human. The storm passed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind that peculiar silence that follows intense weather, a stillness that felt charged with potential, and the clean smell of rain-washed air seeping through every crack in the house's structure. Mara and Caleb remained on the couch, neither quite ready to break the fragile connection that had formed between them. And in the quiet aftermath of their shared confessions, something shifted, some possibility emerging from the ruins of their respective isolations. The power had stabilized, and the lamp in the corner cast warm light across the room, illuminating the photographs on the walls and the evidence of a life that continued despite its central absence. And Mara found herself seeing her own space differently now, seeing how she'd turned it into a shrine rather than a home, a memorial to the past rather than a foundation for whatever future might still be possible. Caleb's presence had disrupted the careful stasis she'd maintained, had introduced complication and new grief, but also the possibility of moving forward in ways that honored Daniel's memory without being imprisoned by it. "He would have wanted you to forgive him," Caleb said quietly, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Daniel on the mantel, the formal portrait taken just before deployment that captured a version of her husband who still believed in clear moral categories and his own invincibility. "But more than that, I think he would have wanted you to understand that what happened doesn't change who he was fundamentally, doesn't erase the man you knew and loved or make that love somehow false or misplaced. The words carried the weight of someone who had thought deeply about these questions, who had wrestled with the meaning of Daniel's death and the significance of his final confession, and Mara recognized that Caleb had been doing the interpretive work she would now need to do, had been living with these questions long enough to develop some provisional answers. She considered his words carefully, testing them against her own understanding of Daniel and the marriage they'd shared, and she found truth in what Caleb suggested, that the man who had written that anguished letter was the same man who had courted her with patience and humor, who had been kind to animals and generous with friends, who had chosen military service out of genuine idealism rather than lack of alternatives. But Mara also realized that part of Daniel's gift to her, his final act of love, was to refuse her the comfort of simple hagiography, to insist that she know him as he'd been, rather than as myth or memory might reconstruct him. He'd understood that real love requires seeing another person clearly, with all their flaws and uncertainties, and that the idealized version she might construct in his absence would ultimately fail to sustain her, because it would be addressing someone who never existed, rather than the complicated human being who had shared her life. By confessing his doubt and moral struggle, Daniel had given her permission to remember him as real, to carry forward a relationship with the actual man rather than with her projection of perfection, and that gift now seemed more precious than any comfortable lie would have been. She looked at Caleb and saw similar understanding in his eyes, saw that he too grasped the significance of Daniel's choice to tell the truth, even when silence might have been easier or kinder in conventional terms. "What happens now?" Mara asked, the question encompassing more than just the immediate evening or the disposition of the letter that lay between them. She was asking about how they moved forward from this moment, how they carried these truths into whatever futures awaited them, whether the connection they'd forged through shared grief and Daniel's memory would extend beyond this single night or dissolve back into their separate isolations. Caleb seemed to understand the breadth of her question, and she watched him wrestle with how to respond, saw the conflict between his instinct to retreat and some fragile hope that maybe connection was still possible for someone as damaged as he believed himself to be. The silence stretched between them, but it no longer felt oppressive or hostile, instead carrying the quality of space where difficult thoughts could form and courage could gather itself for the leap into vulnerability and uncertain reciprocity. "I've been existing rather than living," Caleb said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "using the promise I made to Daniel as an excuse not to engage with my own life, not to try for anything better because I didn't believe I deserved it after surviving when better men didn't." The confession emerged with visible difficulty, each word a struggle against the habits of isolation and self-protection that had calcified over years of avoiding exactly this kind of honest exchange. "But seeing you, watching how you've built a life despite your loss, it makes me wonder if maybe Daniel's final gift wasn't just for you, but for me too. Permission to acknowledge the complexity of what we experienced and still try to move forward, to honor the dead by actually living rather than just surviving in their shadow." Mara felt tears threatening again, but they were different now, containing something that might eventually become hope rather than just the familiar weight of loss and regret. They talked through the night, the conversation ranging across their separate experiences of grief and survival, discovering unexpected points of connection and recognition in each other's struggles. Caleb described his isolation not from self-pity, but from genuine puzzlement at how to bridge the distance between military and civilian experience, how to translate the lessons learned in war zones into frameworks that had relevance in ordinary life. And Mara recognized similar struggles in her own attempts to relate to friends whose worst days involved traffic and missed appointments rather than telegrams from the Department of Defense. They discussed Daniel with the freedom that comes from accepting his full humanity, remembering his humor and his flaws alongside his courage and devotion, constructing between them a more complete portrait than either could hold alone. Outside, dawn began to lighten the sky, the storm-washed air rendering colors with unusual clarity, and Mara realized with surprise that an entire night had passed while they sat together excavating the past and tentatively imagining possible futures. Something fundamental had shifted. Some transformation occurring through the alchemy of honest conversation and witnessed pain, and she understood that regardless of what happened next, she had been changed by this encounter, released from some portion of the prison her grief had constructed. Morning arrived with that crystalline quality that follows severe storms, everything sharp-edged and newly defined, as though the world had been scrubbed clean and reset to some original clarity. And Mara stood at her kitchen window, watching light spread across the rain-soaked landscape, while Caleb dozed on her couch in the exhausted sleep of someone who had finally laid down a burden carried too long. She'd covered him with a blanket sometime before dawn, when his words had finally slowed and stopped, his body surrendering to fatigue that probably went back years, rather than just one intense night. And now she studied his sleeping face, and saw how much younger he looked, without the tension that habitually tightened his features. The letter sat on her kitchen table where she'd left it, Daniel's words no longer radiating threat or anxiety, but simply present as artifact and testimony, evidence of love, complicated enough to survive death, and complicated enough to demand truth over comfort. She thought about the man who had written those words, and the man who had carried them, and the strange grace that had brought them all to this moment of possible transformation. The coffee she made was intentionally loud enough to wake Caleb gently, and she watched him surface from sleep with the jerky alertness of someone whose nervous system never fully relaxed, his eyes scanning for threats before consciousness reminded him where he was and why. He sat up slowly, running a hand through hair that stood at odd angles, and accepted the mug she offered, with a shy gratitude that suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his needs anticipated or met. Morning light revealed details the evening had obscured, the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the particular weariness that comes from fighting battles no one else can see, and Mara felt a surge of protective tenderness that surprised her with its intensity. This man had honored his promise despite enormous personal cost, had refused to take the easier path of silence or selective truth, and that integrity deserved recognition and something more than the isolation he'd sentenced himself to. "I want you to know something," Mara said, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table where she'd eaten thousands of solitary meals in the years since Daniel died. "What you did, coming here and telling me the truth, even though it would have been easier not to, that took more courage than I think you realize. You gave Daniel's memory back to me in a way that makes it possible to carry forward, and you gave yourself the chance to finally stop carrying his death as a weight you weren't meant to bear alone." Caleb looked uncomfortable with the praise, his eyes dropping to study his coffee with intense focus, but she pressed on because she understood he needed to hear this, needed permission to release himself from the promise's grip. "He wouldn't have wanted you to sacrifice your life to honor his memory. The best way to respect what he asked is to take the truth you've delivered and use it to build something better for both of us." The words felt inadequate to what she wanted to convey, but Caleb's eyes, when they met hers, held a glimmer of something that might eventually become acceptance, might grow into the self-forgiveness that seemed to elude him. They talked about practical matters over breakfast that Mara insisted on making, discovering that Caleb was currently living in a rented room across town and working construction jobs that paid in cash and asked no questions about his episodic availability. She learned that he'd been honorably discharged, but had struggled to navigate the Veterans Affairs bureaucracy in ways that might have secured better support. That pride and shame had prevented him from seeking help that might have eased his transition back to civilian life. Mara found herself making plans without quite realizing she was doing so, thinking about connections she could facilitate and resources she'd discovered during her own journey through grief. And she recognized that helping Caleb might be one way to honor Daniel's memory more actively than the passive shrine-keeping she'd been doing. The man sitting across from her had been fundamentally decent enough to carry an uncomfortable truth across years of hardship, and that decency deserved better than the isolation and struggle that had characterized his post-war existence. As Caleb prepared to leave, standing in her doorway much as he had the previous evening, but transformed now from stranger into something approaching friend, Mara found herself reluctant to let him disappear back into whatever marginal existence he'd been occupying. "Come back," she said, the words emerging without planning or rehearsal, but feeling absolutely right nonetheless. "Not because of obligation or the promise you made, but because I think we might help each other figure out how to move forward rather than just survive. Daniel connected us, but maybe we can build something that honors his memory without being entirely defined by it." Caleb looked startled by the invitation, hope and fear warring visibly across his features, and she could see him wrestling with the ingrained belief that he didn't deserve connection or the complications that came with accepting offered kindness. But something in her directness seemed to bypass his defenses, and he nodded slowly, a tentative agreement that felt more significant than its simplicity suggested. Over the following weeks and months, Caleb became a regular presence in Mara's life, their connection deepening through shared meals and conversations that ranged from the profound to the mundane, and she watched him slowly unfold from the defensive crouch that had characterized their first meeting into someone capable of occasional laughter and hope. She helped him navigate the Veterans Affairs system with the persistence of someone who had learned to advocate effectively, and gradually they secured benefits and support that began to address some of his most pressing needs. He helped her begin the process of transforming her house from memorial into home, gently encouraging her to pack away some of Daniel's things, not to erase his presence, but to make space for her own continued living. And she found that these changes felt like honoring his memory rather than betraying it. They discovered that grief shared became more bearable, that carrying the weight of Daniel's complicated legacy was easier when the burden was distributed across two sets of shoulders, rather than isolating each of them in separate prisons of loss and guilt. The letter remained in its place on Mara's bookshelf, no longer a source of anxiety or dread, but simply one artifact among many in a life that was learning to hold both past and present, loss and possibility in the same moment without contradiction. She understood now that Daniel's final gift had been truth complicated enough to honor their relationship, confession brave enough to trust her with his full humanity, and she carried that gift forward not as weight but as foundation for whatever future she might build. Caleb had delivered more than a letter. He delivered the possibility of moving beyond grief's paralysis into something that might eventually be called healing, and in doing so had perhaps saved them both from the slow death of isolation and unprocessed trauma. Sometimes, Mara thought, the promises we make to the dying turn out to be gifts for the living, obligations that force us into the very connections we've been avoiding but desperately need. The weight had lifted, not through forgetting or denial, but through the courage to face difficult truths and the grace to accept help carrying what couldn't be borne alone.